Hey, did you know there's one camera setting that will make your images almost indistinguishable from the pros? Yes, it's all about f-stop and aperture, and I'm gonna give you all the basics. We're gonna start it right now. Hey everyone, my name is Sean Seymour, and if we are just meeting, I own a photography studio in Sacramento, California, and I can tell you that although it seems basic, understanding aperture and f-stop is the first real step to taking pictures like the pros. It never hurts to have people go ooh and ah over your images because they look so professional. I'm going to cover the basics of how the aperture in your lens works, talk a little bit about primes and zooms, clear up the understanding of what f-stop actually means, and how to use your aperture and f-stop to create some awesome looking images. Hey, if you don't already know, by pressing that like button in the description box below, that tells YouTube that they should show this video to other people. You can also hit the subscribe button if you want to follow along with my channel, and the bell notification will give you a notification that I have uploaded a new video and that maybe you should go take a look. Oh yeah, I forgot one thing. If you have any buddies, any friends. Do I have any friends? I don't know if I have any friends. I have a friend. Hey, maybe friends. If you have friends, hey, feel free to share this with your photographer friends. Okay, now we're flowing, brah. Aperture is simply a hole in your lens that allows light to pass by and expose your sensor. Your aperture can get wider or it can get narrower, either allowing in more light or restricting light from coming into the camera and exposing your sensor. The aperture mechanics in your camera work similarly to those in your eye. The iris in your eye opens wider to allow more light in when you're in a dark situation, think like standing in a dark room, and closes to restrict the amount of light in a bright situation, think standing outside and squinting on a sunny day. That's the basics of the mechanical parts of your lens's aperture. How about the basics of your lens? Every lens has a front element. That's the light gathering big chunk of glass in the very front of your lens. The bigger the lens, the more light it can gather. Each lens has a maximum aperture or a maximum opening and a focal length. In broader terms, the focal length is usually what we call the size of the lens, like a 50 millimeter or a 200 millimeter. Both of these specifications are the focal length. Both the focal length and the aperture are going to be printed right on the front or the sideband of the lens. Larger aperture lenses cost more money. They have more light gathering power, bigger lenses, bigger elements, but these lenses also let you get more creative. Lenses that are a 2.8 or lower are usually considered to be fast lenses because they let in more light. Lenses that are a 4 or a 5.6 are considered to be slow because they don't let in as much light. But those lenses aren't as expensive. A general theme in photography is the more light the better. How much better? That's something you and your pocketbook have to decide. Let's move on to prime lenses. Prime lenses are lenses that don't zoom, meaning you have to move physically forward or backwards to zoom in or out. In general, dollar for dollar, prime lenses tend to be faster than zoom lenses. Prime lenses will only list a maximum aperture, whereas some zoom lenses have something called a variable aperture. A quick note for you beginning photographers, this number is not the maximum aperture, but is your filter size for the lens. If you want to put a filter on the outside, let's say a UV filter or a neutral density filter. I'm like, oh, 72 millimeters. What does that mean? It's actually your filter size. Some less expensive zoom lenses have that variable aperture. That means that as you zoom closer to your subject, your lens narrows down and is unable to collect the same amount of light, and therefore has a smaller aperture or smaller opening. Take this lens for example. At 15 millimeters, the largest aperture is 3.5, but at 45 millimeters, it shrinks to f6.3. You'll see this on the lens as 1:3.5-6.3. That's a variable aperture zoom lens. So in contrast, zoom lenses that list only one aperture are called non-variable zoom lenses and are usually faster, much faster, and more expensive than variable zoom lenses. When only one aperture is listed, it means that the lens can maintain its maximum aperture opening through its full zoom range. So the maximum aperture, f2.8, at 70 millimeters is the same as a maximum aperture, f2.8, at 200 millimeters. And as you might imagine, this lens is more expensive, and that's the basics about aperture as it relates to lenses. Let's move on to f-stops. I think people find f-stop confusing and difficult to get their heads wrapped around, not because they can't, but because of the way it's typically explained. There's even one popular person on YouTube explaining that f-stop means stop light, which I guess from a practical standpoint is true, but has absolutely nothing to do with why the word stop is in f-stop or what the f is in f-stop. Let me also say that you do not need to know any of the science or history behind f-stop in order to be a good photographer. Hot in here. Okay, the F. In f-stop, the F. Remember back in high school when we all took algebra and we were always doing addition, subtraction, multiplying and dividing everything by x or by y? Like x minus 1 over y equals x. I had nightmares over that stuff, and as a creative, it drove me nuts. Not to deep dive back into those nightmares or those horrifying days, but the F in f-stop is nothing more than a placeholder for a number, just like x and y were back in our algebra days. F is a placeholder, but a placeholder for what? It stands for the focal length of your lens. For example, if I'm using a 50 millimeter lens, the F in my f-stop stands for 50. If I have a 200 millimeter lens, then the F stands for 200, and so on. Whatever the focal length of your lens, or in basic photography terms, the size of your lens, that is the F in f-stop. This will all make sense after I cover this next part. You probably know that the shutter speed in your camera settings are fractions of a second, but expressed in whole numbers. For example, 1/60th of a second shutter speed is usually just the number 60 on your top window of your digital camera. Just like how your camera's shutter speed is expressed as a whole number when in fact it's a fraction, your f-stop is also a fraction that is usually expressed as a whole number. Certainly adds to the photography confusion, doesn't it? What does this fraction mean? If you replace f with focal length of your lens and divide by the number you've chosen for your f-stop, stay with me, say 2.8, you will end up with the actual diameter of your aperture in millimeters, the actual opening that allows light into your camera. So if I have a 50 millimeter lens, which is the focal length, and I choose f2.8, the math works like this. 50 over 2.8, or 50 divided by 2.8, equals 17.5 millimeters. You can see that my f2 maximum aperture lens, when I stop it down to f2.8, that the opening is actually going to be 17.85 millimeters. If I take this down to an f8, you can see that the opening has gotten even smaller. But why should that make sense? It makes sense because it's a fraction. If I do the math, 50 over 8, or 50 divided by 8, it equals 6.25 millimeters, which is smaller versus where we started at 17.85 with our 2.8 setting. Many people get confused at the beginning because they see f-stop and they think it's a whole number. In fractions, the amount gets smaller the larger that the bottom number of the fraction gets. In this case, we're talking about the size of the aperture opening. Let me throw one more fun example at you. Which is larger, 1/4 or 1/16? You're probably like, this is a trick question, I know this is. Let me put it in my own words. If I get 1/4 of a pizza, I'm a happy guy. That's a lot of pizza for me. If I get 1/16 of a pizza, I'm cranky Sean. I'm starved. It works the same way with your aperture. 1/4 is a much larger opening than 1/16. In photography, they like to confuse people by removing the fraction and expressing these numbers as whole numbers. This is probably the single most confusing thing for a beginning photographer. Whole numbers when they mean fractions. So in my pizza example, 1/4 in photography is expressed as 4, and 1/16 is expressed as 16. At first glance, and not knowing any better, you would think that the 16 is bigger than the 4, unless you knew that these are actually representing fractions and not whole numbers. Hopefully, it now makes sense why f4 in your camera settings is a larger opening, or more pizza, than f16, which is a smaller opening and cranky Sean. If I use my 50mm lens example again, earlier we had an opening of 17.85 at f2.8. Now do the math for f16. At f16, the opening's only like 3mm, much smaller than 17.85. If you can get that concept that both your shutter speed and your f-stop are actually fractions that are usually expressed as whole numbers in your camera's settings, you'll be miles ahead of most beginning photographers. They are fractions. Last little bit and then I'll move on to how your aperture affects your images. What does the word stop mean in f-stop? I can tell you it does not mean stop light from coming into your camera, as I recently heard on YouTube. In the old days, and yes, that's funny where I came from, the old days, camera lenses had what is called an aperture ring. You'd turn the aperture ring to set the size of your aperture opening. As you turn the aperture ring to the next full stop, it would actually click and come to a stop. You can see this example again in my old school camera lens. Each stop has a slight click, and this led to sayings like go up a full stop or down a full stop, which literally meant spin the aperture ring until it clicked at the next stop. I'm not sure because I don't have access, but I believe this is also true for the film industry. It may have even come from the film industry, and I think the cinema lenses today still have this clicking feature. For photography, everything is typically set in camera electronically, and we no longer have aperture rings on our lenses. So the word stop in f-stop, at least for photographers, has become more of a reference to the measure of light versus physically moving the aperture ring around the outside of the lens. We've covered the basics of f-stop. We know that f is a placeholder for the focal length or size of your lens and is part of a fraction where the f is divided by the number you've chosen for your aperture. 2.8, 4, 5, 6, 8, whatever. And if you do the math, the result is the actual opening of the aperture in millimeters. And we now know that the word stop actually came from the aperture ring on a lens clicking when you reach the next stop. So that's the basics. Now let's take a look at how the f-stop and thereby the size of the aperture opening you choose affects the images you create. Aside from controlling how much light enters your camera, the aperture size also controls something called depth of field. I like to talk about depth of field as controlling what is blurry and out of focus versus what is sharp and in focus. The basics are pretty simple. The center of your depth of field is the area of the image that is going to be most sharp. The smaller the aperture opening, say f16, and we just learned that f16 is actually a fraction, the more your foreground and background will appear to be in focus. As you open your aperture, say f2.8, your depth of field shrinks and becomes more shallow, and the foreground and background become more blurry or out of focus. Let's use Skittles as an example. Can't go wrong with Skittles. I try to use them anytime I can. The first image has almost everything in focus from about 6 inches all the way to the bowl, and it was shot on an 85mm lens at f16. So in this situation, we would say the depth of field is about 6 inches. This next image was shot with the same 85mm lens, but at its maximum aperture of f1.4. You can see that only the yellow Skittle is in focus. It's amazing how shallow the depth of field is for this lens with the wide aperture. And as I mentioned earlier, this is where most photographers spend money. Big glass to gather lots of light to achieve this look. So in this example, we would say the depth of field is less than a half an inch, if not closer to maybe a quarter of an inch. It's literally nothing. Super shallow. Even the Skittle that's only 1 inch away from the yellow Skittle is completely out of focus. That's why a lens like this is such a great portrait lens. The subject's face is in focus without any of the foreground or background being in focus, which is typically what you want when you're trying to highlight only your subject and not the distracting or surrounding environment. Okay, I won't do a deep dive as to the science, but generally each lens with its aperture opening and its different focal length will have a different range for its depth of field. Here's an example. Usually wide-angle lenses or shorter focal length lenses will have more depth of field, or in other words, more foreground and more background in focus, and a telephoto lens or a lens with a longer focal length will have a shallower depth of field or less of the foreground and background in focus. Let's take a quick look at an example. Here's that Skittle again, taken with my 85mm lens at f16. you can see that there's only about 6 inches depth of field, and we start losing the foreground at around 12 inches. And if there was anything in the background, it would be hard to tell what it was. Now look at this image, taken with my 16 to 35 zoom at f8. By the way, this is a non-variable zoom lens, maximum aperture of f2.8. Almost the whole room is in focus. And if I wanted to push it to, say, f16, like I did with the 85mm, I could probably get everything to look sharp. Remember, as our aperture opening gets smaller, more of the foreground and background will be in focus. So for this lens, which is a wide-angle lens, when you go from f8 to f16, it should increase my depth of field or make more of the foreground and background in focus. Okay, that's my overview of aperture and f-stop and how depth of field is affected by your aperture opening. Hey, I appreciate your time and hopefully you got something out of this video. If you did, I would love for you to comment below in the description box along with hitting that like button, which tells YouTube to show this to other people. If you want to subscribe to my channel, I will be releasing more videos, and if you hit the bell notification, YouTube will notify you when they come out. Until we see each other on the next video, keep it simple, my friend. Wait a second. Until we see each other on the next video, keep it simple, my friend.